Everyone, welcome back to the Revelation class. In this video, we'll be looking at Revelation chapter 21 in its entirety. As well as if you're looking at your Jim Jones material, you're looking at week 13, days 1 and 2. So we'll be looking at those things as well as your slides. Remember to have those with you. Without further ado, what I'd like you to do is read Revelation chapter 21, at least go through verse 1 through 8 as of right now, and we'll talk about it. Alright, having read verses 1 through 8, you're probably re-familiarized with this passage that is so rich. You've probably read this passage in parts of it in different occasions for different times. It's probably one of the most well-known things about the book of Revelation from those who are believers, from those who, just about anyone knows the last two chapters of Revelation. And because, we so commonly associate it with heaven. And in this passage, in the first 8 verses, for our consideration, I would like us to look at it as though we are talking about heaven. And I'll address a few other lines of thought too, but I think that through looking at these verses and looking at what they're saying and in the context of it, it really seems to me that we are talking about heaven. In chapter 20, it seemed to me that towards the end there was a final judgment of everything. And so John sees something, there's a break in it. We're no longer talking about just the Christians under Roman government, but it seems like there's a break in it. There's a final judgment. And now we are talking about what comes after that. And as verse 1 tells us, I'll read it, it says, "Now I saw in heaven a new earth, and for the first heaven, and the first earth had passed away, and also there was no more sea." I think this, is just in league with 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, where it talks about, also a new beginning, a new earth, new heaven, where righteousness dwells. Right now, right now we live on earth, and I don't think righteousness dwells. So there is a new place where it does. And of course, if you go on, verse 8, it tells us, why righteousness dwells. Well, it's because none of the sin and none of the bad stuff is there anymore. It's in a different place, and we'll address that a little bit later on. But this is just the perfect place. This is just the perfect place for a Christian. It's where righteousness dwells. And we'll focus something a little bit later on what it says. There's also someone else dwells there. But it is just characterized by this righteousness, and it'd be a great place to be. But remember, it seems to me as though it comes after a final judgment from chapter 20. And it says also in verse 1, it says, "There's also no more sea." I think we've done our best in this study to talk about what the sea represents in the book of Revelation, right? The sea represents human society. Chapter 17 refers to a woman, she's over the sea, and the sea, is just very plainly talking about human society where men dwell, attitudes, convictions, it is, and a lot of times it is seen in a very poor light. But as it says in another passage, around the throne there's a sea of glass, right? The sea may not be there anymore, but a purified sea still is. And I don't think that imagery is just there by accident. I think that it makes a lot of sense to us. Revelation chapter 8 talks about the sea of glass. And then you can go to the passages that you see on screen talking about that second point, right? No more sea, not referring to a sea of glass, but the sea of corrupt human society. So if you read right there, verse 1, sorry about that short interruption, we had some technical difficulties. But if you read that, what it says, verse 1, the sea of glass had been done away with, and obviously the sea of glass there, and I don't think that imagery is accidental. The sea meaning human society, corrupt society, but a sea of glass around the throne of God, I think that is meant to say, now society has been purified. The ones who are around the throne of God are purified. It's not the same that it was on earth, which, by the way, has been done away with by now. And the contrast between what is on heaven and what is on earth, you see later on in what is on heaven, what is in the other direction, I'll put it that way for right now, you see there in verse 8. Anyways, you continue reading on verse 2, and it talks about a bridegroom, a new city coming and being joined. And I think this new Jerusalem that is mentioned is really the perfect dwelling for God's people. A lot of people, some, and it might hold some merit, view that verse and think that it's only really talking about God's people here on earth They don't really see it as something talking about heaven. And for our consideration, we'll be looking at it through the lens of, we're reading chapter 21 and 22 as if we're talking about our final destination in heaven. And certainly that argument can hold some water, talking about, that this is just talking about God's people on earth. But I think that there is so much more stronger evidence and more evidence to suggest that we are talking about a second way of existing in heaven. And so what I'd like for you to do is open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. I'll show you the verses on screen where we're looking at, Hebrews chapter 11. And I want us to read right there in the context under Abraham. As we consider this point, we're talking about the church still here on earth, or are we talking about heaven? So it says in Hebrews chapter 11, you read right there what it says. Verse 8, obviously we're talking about Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed, right? Don't we know that? And so all those things it says in verse 10, for he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. I think sometimes we read that passage and think, I think most of us, our minds go to heaven, right? He was waiting for a city whose maker and of the foundations was God. I think that's how we perceive it. He's talking about heaven there. There are some, and like I said, there's some merit to this, but I would still suggest that it's talking about heaven. But there are some good Christians who consider this and they say, well, this is really actually talking about the church, that Abraham waited for the church. There were promises that were made to him, to Abraham, and he was actually waiting for the fulfillment of some of those so that way he could see the church rather than just, a heavenly city. So I want us to turn now to chapter 12, Hebrews, and if you read what it says in verse 22 and 23, I think it's so clear that, he is talking about the church in that context. So reading what it says in chapter 12, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22 and 23, it says, but you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven, to God and the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect. I think in that context, when it talks about it, I think it's pretty clear that yes, in that context, it's talking about a church. Now, as we turn to Hebrews chapter 13, read what it says in verse 13 and 14. I think it makes a pretty good comparison for us to understand that later on in Revelations, it is talking about heaven as in a second realm of existence rather than the church here on earth. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 13. Therefore, let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his word. Verse 14. For here we have no continuing city, but we seek the one to come. We do have a continuing city, and that's the one that we're looking for, and that's talking about heaven. So I say all these things to say, I think that when we look at Revelation chapter 21, we should probably turn our Bibles back over there. Revelation chapter 21. I think there are just too many things that show us that we're not talking about the church here on earth, but as in Revelation chapter 21, talking about heaven, the next realm of existence. There are just a lot of things that have to go with that. I'm trying to think of a few, just verse 4, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There should be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. Obviously, in the church, we still have those things. There's still death, crying, and sorrow. But in the second world of existence, there is none of that. But if we're still thinking that Revelation 21 is talking about the church here on earth, well, obviously that doesn't go with it. Verse 4, those things still happen here on earth. Verse 8, you still have people like that here on earth. There isn't a separation of these two places. So I say these things so we can, in our consideration of Revelation 21, talking about as heaven, the new city. So as we've mentioned, you look at the slides and you look at the next point that comes up. Not only is it the perfect dwelling for God's people, but it's also the tabernacle of God who is with men. You think about the Old Testament, right? The tabernacle, there was only one time a year that, the Most High Priest could go into the tabernacle and say, I'm going to go into the Holy of Holies and be with God where He is. But thankfully, that is no longer an issue. And I know Christ, in a lot of ways, allowed us to go into the holies of holies, but it says that there, the tabernacle of God is with men. Now it is a permanent, I see there, a permanent joining of the two place. The slides say God's presence accounts for man's blessedness, no tears, death, sorrow, or pain. The fact that we are with God in a new place means that those things no longer exist. And part of the reason they don't exist, and I'm jumping ahead now, but I'll address verse 8, is because there's another place in verse 8. It says, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, abominable, those things that you've heard before, right? The liars, probably stuff that you taught your children. Liars go to hell. What says verse 8? It says, they will have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. The reason that there's no sorrow or crying, obviously it's because we're with God, but there's also separation for all the ungodly. As we mentioned before, this is a place where righteousness dwells, while the unrighteousness goes to that other place, the lake of fire that burns with fire and brimstone. So I think here, probably one of the richest passages in the Bible, especially in Revelation. But the idea here is, obviously, I think you have access to this place if, verse 7, you overcome, you shall inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. So, to wrap up almost the entire book of Revelation together, is that in the first chapter 2 and 3, we are told there are going to be problems against Christians. And then in chapter 6, those Christians, some of them would be put to death because of those problems and persecutions, and they ask God, how long is it going to be until you avenge us? I think chapter 20 is some of that vengeance taking place, and now is the reward. Some of the prettiest pieces of scripture here. There's not going to be any more dying. There's not going to be any more sick. All of that's going to be done away with. And like I said, richest pieces of scripture right here. You've probably gone over them a million times. But we can't put enough emphasis on how awesome and how refreshing that kind of experience will be. We've all had loved ones that have passed, friends and family, possibly some that we were close to that weren't part of the church and we're not sure of their eternal destination. And that's always hard to deal with. Maybe, family that's even like that, that's hard to deal with. But once you're in heaven, there's no more dying. And I think that's something you can't let go of, right? Our mind just kind of attaches to that idea. And so you see some pictures on screen, right? I think it does us good to see what this Jerusalem would have looked like, right? I think it's good to put in our mind's eye. At this time, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read Revelation chapter 21, verse 9, and you can go ahead and go to verse 21. We'll talk about it here in the next section. Revelation 21, verses 9 through 21. All right, having read verses 9 through 21, let's talk about the things that are seen there. You've probably read through these passages a couple of times before, as you see, the way that the new city is built, what it might have looked like. In verse 9 and 10, one of the seven angels who had poured out the seven bowls, he talks to John and says, come here, I want to show you something. I want to show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he takes him up to the city and he shows him what it looks like. And he carried him away in the spirit to a great and high mountain and showed the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, and her light was like the most precious stone, like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. And I think, I think that's awesome. This is just a bright, shining kind of day. I think later on, it'll say something like there's no night there. Obviously, going back to our point, if we're talking about Revelation 21 being the church, still on earth, that doesn't really apply there. I think it's more still talking about heaven. This place is constantly illuminated. It's great. It's awesome. And it gives sort of some of the dimensions to it, as we'll see a little bit later on. But it says, there's this great and high wall. Nothing's getting in that's not supposed to. Nothing's getting out that's not supposed to. The Great Wall of China, not sure you care or not, but the Great Wall of China would have been really effective in what it was supposed to do, ward off anybody who wasn't supposed to be in China. But the reason it wasn't as effective as it was supposed to be was because the gatekeepers took bribes. So people weren't actually climbing over the wall. They were actually just going through it because the gatekeepers were allowing them to. That's not going to happen in heaven, right? Heaven's going to be well protected. It is where God's people dwells. Out of all of everything that you just read there, something that appears time and again is the number 12. What have we mentioned throughout the book of Revelation? What does the number 12 mean? Yeah, number 12 typically indicates God's people in some, fashion, some capacity. 12 sons of Jacob, which brought us the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, which, by the way, in verse 14 are mentioned again. So you can think about it like this, 12 is God's people. When people think about me, they think about chocolate milk sometimes, because we talked about it to the congregation at Hueytown. Sometimes they'll bring up chocolate milk or soccer or something like that. Think about soccer, right? So if someone were to build a house for me, and they know that I'm all about chocolate milk and soccer and this and that, they would probably, if they were to build a house especially for me, they would probably include a soccer field somewhere or some goals, endless amounts of Nesquik chocolate powder in the cabinets and things like that. And I say those things, I know it's kind of funny, but the reason I say those things is because it's a representative of who I am. 12 is a representative of God's people. So if I were to build a house for you, and whatever anybody thinks about you, they think about the number 12. That is your defining trait. Then they would put probably 12 trees in your yard, 12 windows. Make sure there are 12 rooms in the house, things like that. My point there is 12 is everywhere because this is about God's people. And so, anyways, he gives them this, he shows them the city there, what it might have looked like. And by the way, a lot of people, unfortunately, don't take, if something's not written in red letters, in the Bible, it's basically up to suggestion. And even then, they're kind of liberal with the red letters. But if you notice here, look at what it says, verse 14. Now on the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. I don't think that the 12 apostles' names are there by accident. Just by seeing what heaven looks like and seeing that the 12 apostles, their names are written around, just means directly that they were representatives of Christ himself. And if you don't want to listen to the things they say written to us in Scripture through the book of Acts, through the rest of the epistles and things like that, then you're not going to get heaven. You're not going to get what it's like. Because they were representatives of him. Some people, they want heaven, but they don't want to listen to the apostles, who were given authority by Christ himself. They were representatives of Christ himself. And I think that's just a point to bring out. And so, there's these, it's written out like a square, right? The city looks like a square. And there are, three gates, on every wall. One facing the east, the north, the south, the west, and the east. And, I take that as to mean, there's people, Christians from all corners of the world who are coming into this great city. And as it says to us, how big this place might have been. It says there are 12 gates, 12 angels, 12 names of tribes on the gates. Each gate has a pearl. It says in that last slide, that very last point, the dimensions are 12,000 furlongs square. That would mean somewhere around 1,500 miles. And the width of the wall is 144 cubits, which is about 216 feet. So pretty thick walls you see there, and how big the city might have been. And what all that means, I'm not sure that there is meaning to it. If there is, I've missed it. I think just giving us some imagery of what it might have looked like. There's nothing that we could precisely put down with it, more than likely. Anyways, so as we see right there in those verses what it might have looked like, I want us now to consider the last several verses of this chapter. So go ahead and read verse 22 through 27 as we come to the close of Revelation chapter 21. As you've read verse 22 through 27, we're introduced to the contents inside the city. It said, I saw no temple in it because the Lamb and God are its temple. In other words, this is where God dwells. So he's inside the city. And there's no need of a sun or a moon for it because the Lamb is constantly illuminating it. When I read verses like that in verse 24, 25, I don't really see how this could really be talking about the church on earth. And I bring that point out again because for our consideration, I have to remind ourselves that we are talking about heaven here. And in this city is where God is. That's where heaven is. It's where God is. And that's where the Lamb will be its light, verse 24. And the nation of those who are saved shall walk in its light, and the kings of earth bring their glory and honor to it. So there's some confusion here who the kings of earth are, because if we've gotten as far as Revelation chapter 21, right? The kings of earth in the past of Revelation, the first 20 chapters, weren't really good people. Anybody who dwelled on the earth, typically seen as wicked people, the kings of the earth, rulers. I think this is really talking about as in a spiritual sense. The kings of who are on earth now come into this heavenly city, not necessarily talking about the kings of the rulers of governments and things like that, but the spiritual kings and queens who we are, for being children of God, as mentioned in other verses in the Bible. And its gates shall not be shut all day. There is no night there. And they shall bring the glory and honor to the nations into it. There shall be by no means, verse 27, there shall be by no means enter anything that defiles, causes abomination, or lie, but in those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. The church right now cannot, completely be free of things that defile. Paul talks about things that defile the congregation in Corinth, if you go back to those two epistles. So I said to say again, I don't think this is talking about the church here on earth. It's talking about a new place, completely clean, completely righteous. And the only ones who are allowed in, and now I'm kind of switching focus to sort of an application of it, is anyone who is written in the Lamb's book of life. You are allowed to be in there. So if you miss that part of it, getting your name written in there, you miss everything because you're not allowed back in. Listen to a Chris Emerson lesson not too long ago. He's a preacher out in Texas. He did a really good job about talking about, if the parable or if the real story of the rich man Lazarus was real, the three simple rules you can learn from it. One of them being is the fact that once you're there, you can't move. Once you're in one of your final destinations, heaven or hell, or we talk about Hades, if we talk about that passage, there's no going back. There's no going forward, there's no going backward, you're stuck where you are. So when that second coming comes and after the final judgment, represented in chapter 20, Revelation chapter 20, you can't do anything about it. So the lesson here is very clearly for us, make sure that by that time we are ready to be written in the Lamb's book of life. So consider the things that we talked about in Revelation chapter 1. Hopefully they'll be good for your learning. Looking forward to a lot of things. I probably don't talk about it in just the best sense. I'm sure that if we were in a classroom study, there would be a lot of discussion, especially about the first 8 verses, in the sense that there are so many good things about it. There are so many good things about verse 22 through 27. And I'm sure there would be discussion and oohs and ahs about that because we long for it so much, don't we? So consider those things as you study Revelation chapter 21. And Lord willing, in a future video, we'll be looking at Revelation chapter 22 and closing out this winter quarter. Thank you.